Do you carry the blood of raiders or the people they found waiting? That single question unsettles many Americans with British or Irish roots. Family stories often say, "We're Celtic," or "We descend from Vikings." But modern genetics tells a far more complex and far more fascinating story. This essay restructures and expands the original material into 8 deep analytical sections, integrating current population genetics, archaeology, and historical context. Written specifically for a US audience interested in ancestry, identity, and deep history, what emerges is not a contest between Celts and Vikings, but a record of collision, absorption, and survival. Celts and Vikings were never just tribes in the way popular culture imagines them. Long before DNA testing existed, these labels described ways of life, languages spoken, tools used, customs shared, not fixed biological groups. The Celts, in particular, were not a single people. They were a vast mosaic of Iron Age societies, stretching from Iberia through Gaul and into Central Europe, even reaching as far as Anatolia. What connected them was not blood, but cultural continuity, related languages, shared symbols, and similar material traditions that evolved slowly over centuries. The Vikings were something entirely different. They were not an ethnic group at all, but a historical phase, a period of intense maritime expansion undertaken by Scandinavian populations between roughly 750 and 1050 CE. To be Viking was to participate in exploration, raiding, trade, and settlement across the North Atlantic world. Modern genetics confirms what history only hinted at. Neither Celts nor Vikings were biologically uniform. The real distinction lies in how their populations formed. Celtic regions show deep, long-term continuity from the Bronze and Iron Ages. Viking populations, by contrast, reveal recent population bottlenecks, extreme mobility, and expansion driven largely by men, a pattern that will reappear again and again in every genetic layer we examine next. Popular imagery has trained us to recognize Celts by red hair and Vikings by blonde hair. It is a powerful visual shortcut, but genetics tells a far more cautious story. Red hair, driven largely by variants of the MC1R gene, does reach its highest global frequencies in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Yet the same genetic variants also appear in Scandinavia, reminding us that no trait respects modern cultural borders. Blonde hair alleles are indeed elevated in Sweden and parts of eastern Scandinavia, but ancient DNA from Viking Age burials reveals something unexpected. A wide spectrum of hair colors, not a single dominant look. Where genetics becomes more revealing is not in appearance, but in population-linked conditions. One striking example is hereditary hemochromatosis, an iron overload disorder often nicknamed the Celtic curse. This condition occurs at unusually high rates in Irish and Scottish populations, reflecting deep Atlantic population continuity rather than Viking migration. Traits like these do not prove ancestry on their own, but they whisper, and when combined with deeper genetic markers, those whispers begin to form a coherent story written not on the surface but beneath it. If there is one genetic layer where the difference between Celtic and Viking ancestry becomes unmistakably clear, it is Y DNA. Passed almost unchanged from father to son, the Y chromosome preserves a record of male lineage that can stretch back thousands of years, and in this record, the contrast is striking. Among Viking-associated lineages, haplogroup I1 stands out immediately. Rare in Iron Age Britain, it reaches its highest concentrations in Scandinavia and is often nicknamed the Wodan lineage, reflecting its deep roots in Norse and Germanic populations. Another powerful signal is R1AZ284, a branch found almost exclusively in Scandinavia and repeatedly identified in Viking Age burials. R1BU106 adds a third layer, linking northern Germany and Denmark to the movements of Anglo-Saxons and especially Danish Vikings. Celtic paternal lineages tell a very different story. R1BL21 forms the backbone of Atlantic Celtic populations, while R1BDF27 dominates Iberian and southwestern Celtic regions. R1BU 152 traces continental Celts across ancient Gaul and the Alpine world. Crucially, these lineages existed more than 1,000 years before the Viking Age began. When Viking-wide DNA appears in Britain or Ireland, it rarely signals deep native ancestry. Instead, it maps cleanly onto documented Norse settlement zones, clear genetic footprints of arrival, not origin. When genetic analysis moves beyond broad haplogroups and into deeper SNP subclades, many romantic ideas about ancestry begin to collapse. These finer branches expose not legends, but lineages shaped by power, inheritance, and historical chance. In Ireland, the subclade RM222 dominates large parts of Ulster and is closely associated with the ancient Uineal dynasty, whose influence shaped Northern Irish history for centuries. In the south, RL226 reaches its highest frequencies in Munster and is strongly linked to Brian Boru, the High King who resisted Viking dominance at the dawn of the 11th century. Scotland tells a similarly complex story. Subclades such as RL 1335 and RS 190 reflect regional clan development, evolving locally over generations rather than arriving in a single wave. Yet even the most iconic figures defy expectation. Robert the Bruce, often imagined as the embodiment of pure Celtic Scotland, likely carried RDF27, a lineage tied to Iberian and continental roots, revealing Norman ancestry beneath a Scottish crown. DNA does not care about flags, borders, or national myths. It does not record identity as we wish it had been. It records movement, marriage, alliance, and authority. In doing so, it quietly dismantles simple narratives and replaces them with something far more human. While Viking Y DNA spread rapidly and visibly across the North Atlantic, maternal DNA tells a very different and far quieter story. Mitochondrial DNA, passed from mothers to their children, does not trace conquest. It traces continuity. Ancient DNA studies show that Viking Age women carried higher frequencies of mtDNA haplogroups such as K, U, V, and I, lineages common in Scandinavia and parts of Northern Europe. By contrast, Atlantic Celtic regions are dominated by haplogroup H, often accounting for 40 to 50% of maternal lines, a signal of deep population stability stretching back long before the Viking Age. Nowhere is this contrast more revealing than in Iceland. Genetic studies show that roughly 75 to 80% of Icelandic Y DNA is Scandinavian in origin, while 60 to 65% of its mtDNA traces back to Gaelic populations from Ireland and Western Britain. The pattern is unmistakable. Viking expansion was overwhelmingly male-led. Scandinavian men arrived, settled, and formed families with local Celtic women. The sagas hinted at this. Archaeology supports it. Genetics confirms it. What followed conquest was not replacement but fusion. Beneath the noise of raids and voyages lies a quieter truth. The North Atlantic world was built not only by warriors, but by women whose lineages endured long after the ships stopped coming. Surnames are not genetic evidence. They do not carry DNA, and they cannot prove biological ancestry on their own. But they function as cultural fossils, preserving memory, migration, and identity long after the people themselves are gone. When viewed alongside genetics, surnames often align in striking ways with what DNA already suggests. Traditional Celtic surnames such as O'Neill, O'Brien, MacDonald, Campbell, and Jones trace their origins to early medieval Gaelic and Brythonic naming systems rooted in kinship, lineage, and local power. These names reflect societies that emphasize continuity and inheritance across generations. By contrast, surnames shaped by Norse influence, such as Olsen, Eriksson, or Thorpe, carry the linguistic fingerprints of Old Norse language and Scandinavian settlement, especially in regions once touched by Viking expansion. Some of the most revealing names are hybrids. Surnames like MacLeod, Macaskill, and Gunn embody Norse Gaelic fusion, combining Scandinavian personal names with Gaelic structures. They mirror exactly what genetics shows across the North Atlantic world: Scandinavian men arriving, integrating into Celtic societies, and remaining there. The names endured not because of conquest alone, but because families formed, identities blended, and memory outlived the age of sails and swords. Autosomal DNA is the type of genetic test most Americans are familiar with, and it offers the broadest possible view of ancestry. Unlike Y-DNA or mitochondrial DNA, which follow a single parental line, autosomal DNA captures contributions from all ancestral lines at once. This is both its greatest strength and its greatest limitation. It reveals the full picture but often blurs the edges. Within autosomal results, Celtic ancestry clusters closely with Irish, Scottish, Welsh, and Breton populations, reflecting deep continuity with Iron Age Britain and the Atlantic fringe. Viking influence, by contrast, pulls genetic profiles toward Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and the wider North Sea world, tracing the roots of Scandinavian expansion and settlement. Most individuals fall somewhere between these poles, shaped by centuries of migration, intermarriage, and shared history. Some regions stand apart. Orkney and Shetland form a distinct genetic cluster, carrying roughly 25% Scandinavian ancestry, far higher than mainland Scotland. Yet even here, the story is not one of replacement. Autosomal DNA rarely forces a choice between Celtic or Viking. Instead, it reveals what most people truly are: layered, blended, and shaped by time, rather than by a single identity. In the end, DNA does not answer the question most people are really asking. It does not tell you who you are. Genetics is not an identity test. What it reveals instead is something quieter and far more profound: what endured. Every genetic signal that reaches you today has survived centuries of upheaval, war, famine, migration, and collapse. It represents lines that did not disappear. Celtic DNA speaks of continuity. It tells the story of people who remained rooted to the land, who adapted to invasion without being erased, and whose communities endured across the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and beyond. Viking DNA speaks of movement. It records expansion across oceans, the risks of exploration, and the eventual return or settlement that followed. One lineage is shaped by staying, the other by leaving. If you carry both, you are not divided between two pasts. You are their convergence. You are the outcome of continuity meeting motion of endurance intersecting with exploration. Your DNA is not a label. It is a record of survival, written slowly, generation by generation, until it reached you. What if ancestry isn't about choosing a side, but recognizing what survived long enough to reach you? At Prehistoric Shadows, we don't chase myths of purity or conquest. We trace the quiet persistence beneath the noise of history, the lineages that endured after the ships sailed home and the sagas fell silent. If this story resonated, explore further. Leave your ancestry below not as a label, but as a question still unfolding. Because the deepest past is never gone. It's just waiting in your blood.